If you'd asked me just 2 weeks ago who Gene Shepard was, I would have drawn a blank. And if you draw a blank as well, you're probably familiar with the now classic Christmas movie, A Christmas Story. Yes, the one with the Red Ryder BB gun and the often repeated phrase, "You'll shoot your eye out." Shepard was the co-screenwriter of that movie, and it's based on his book, In God We Trust, All Others Pay Cash. And even if you're not familiar with The Christmas Story, I'm sure you're aware of the sitcom Seinfeld, the show that TV Guide once named the greatest TV show of all time. The show's co-creator, Jerry Seinfeld, said this of Shepard: "He really formed my entire sensibility. I learned how to do comedy from Gene Shepard." Today I'm interviewing college professor and author Quentin Schultze, who was not only a friend of Shepard's, but co-taught a class with him. And not just at any college, but at the same college where taxi driver screenwriter Paul Schrader did his undergraduate work. We'll glean insights from Schultze's book, You'll Shoot Your Eye Out, Life Lessons from the movie A Christmas Story, including what Schultze calls the 7-step process that Shepard used to develop ideas. Welcome to Filmmaking with Brass Knuckles. Do I call you Dr. Schultze, Professor Q,
Yeah,
Quinn, or
yeah.
the other Quentin that talks about movies and television all the time?
Oh yeah, that rascal. Here's the book. I just want to show it because of what's on the cover. I couldn't use any of the actual images from the movie. That would cost too much.
But
so
the lamp?
We have the leg lamp, the broken glasses, and we have that leg lamp centered in the front window where the old man wanted to place it because he wanted to turn on the neighborhood. So, there's so many dimensions to this. It goes round and round. But I'd say call me Quentin because even though I'm not Quentin Tarantino, because that's the way the people most get to the book. Or you can call me what my students did, and that's Dr. Q.
Dr. Q, I like that.
It's fun.
That's sassy. So before we get into how you cross paths with Gene, I'd like you to give a sweeping overview of what led Gene's background to that point where I believe he's about 60 when A Christmas Story finally gets made. So even though people know him, those that know him for A Christmas Story, I mean, he had an incredible journey from Chicago, Indiana to Hollywood.
Yes. In fact, Scott, let me say it's a delight to be on with you. And I know that you came up and did a workshop for us at Calvin many years ago. I am now Professor Emeritus, which means I have some status. And I think the status amounts to a parking sticker and library privileges. But
that's a Gene Shepard essay or a story right there.
Right there. So let me just say, anybody tuning this in, before we go any further, okay, if you want to learn storytelling in the 20th century, probably the best storyteller, if we don't include Mark Twain, who died in 1910, in the United States, was a guy by the name of Gene, Jean, Gene Shepard, spelled like shepherding the flock, Gene Shepard. And he died in 1999, but he leaves a legacy of storytelling which is phenomenal. So I was a new communication professor. I got my PhD from the University of Illinois in Champaign in 1978. But even before that, in the late 60s, growing up in Chicago, not too far from where Shepard himself lived, I was listening to him at night on AM radio on WOR. Every night he would go on for 45 minutes an hour telling a story. And he had hundreds of thousands of people tuning in. And so his storytelling was phenomenal. And then he started writing some of them up. He started cutting records, old records we would talk about. We used to call them party records. You would play them at parties, and people would listen to the records, and they were kind of like comedy records, and he would tell stories there. He was doing stage performances in New York City and beyond, speaking on campuses. He spoke at Princeton University every year. And so he was really a phenomenal storyteller, largely self-taught. And so I'm a new professor, and I'm studying communication, and I'm asking myself, what is the most important thing I need to learn, both as a scholar of communication and as a teacher? And those two things go together because teaching is communication. And the number one thing I needed to learn was storytelling. as I am doing with you right now. I'm telling you the story of me meeting him and my background and so forth. Story is the most potent form of human expression. It's not necessarily the most important communication skill. I think that's listening. But in terms of expression, story is what pulls people in, and it can be enchanting. It can be seductive. And you can use it to entertain like he did. You can use it to teach, which he also did. We'll talk about that. You can use it, in fact, in a whole host of different ways. Every purpose for human communication, maybe the most important being persuasion and how politicians use story, so-called narrative now, and the media analyze narratives. This is a big deal, Scott. So all of that's there, and I say, who is that guy? Gene Shepard.
What year is this? What year are we talking about where you kind of crossed paths?
Late 70s. I got my PhD in 78. I kind of flew through graduate school, got it in 78. I was quite young, and I thought to myself, how do I get in touch with this guy? I knew about him. I tried studying storytelling by getting books and studying it from books, or sometimes studying what people were doing if I could get hold of a film or analyze a film or something. This is before the YouTube and all that whole revolution. You have to understand that too, before the internet.
Yeah, I was alive then, and I think I was going to film school from 1980 to 1984, and I think kind of the cottage industry of screenwriting technique started with Sid Field in 79. It might have been republished in 82. I think Robert McKee in L.A. I went to one of the first workshops that he did in L.A., and then it just kind of grew from there. But you're in that no man's land where it's storytelling right now is big with businesses, with everyone. Mm-hmm. But back in the late 70s.
What Sid and others were doing back then, of course, was traveling around. You could go to L.A. or whatever and take one there, but they also went on the road. And so they had these these workshops in different places. But again, that was focused on screenwriting, which is a particular form of storytelling, an important one, and one that Gene Shepard got into. But I'm thinking about this in terms of story overall. If I walk into a classroom and I want to engage those students, how do I use story? Or we could say, how do I use example and illustration in story form? Which is what I started doing as a college teacher, which put me over the line in terms of being a great teacher. Because I knew exactly what story I was going to begin with that was going to bring those students in. And it was phenomenal once I figured that out. So I contacted Shepard because I found out in some article somewhere that he was a ham radio operator. I was a ham radio operator. We both became ham radio operators as kids. So I looked him up in the Federal Communications Commission database, and I got his home address. I can't even remember which home it was. He had different homes in different places. But at any rate, I sent him a letter. I said, I'm a new communication professor. I want to learn storytelling from the best. I think you're the best. Would you teach me? Would you mentor me, essentially? We'll work it out, whatever is convenient for you. And he wrote back to me, astonished that a professor would be contacting him because he was not taken seriously by the academic community. Now, that changed later. In fact, one of his novels, not the one you mentioned earlier, but another one called Wanda Hickey's Night of Golden Memories and Other Disasters, is widely used in creative writing courses as amazing examples of really terrific writing that works on different levels, like literature. You know, you study literature to look at the deeper meaning. You take a literature course or something like that. So at any rate, he responded right away, and so we started interacting. We had to do it either on the phone or sending notes back and forth. We didn't have email and the like. And then eventually I said, okay, I think we should try teaching a storytelling course, and we should use your work only. We'll use it in 5 different media, including you being live on the stage on campus, because he was such a great stage performer. He told one story on stage at Calvin University for an hour and 45 minutes, and he acted out all of the characters using only his body as the prop. Okay? And it was electric. People were going crazy. And many of my colleagues said it was the best performance of anything, and many of them have been to Broadway many times, although Gene had performed on Broadway too. So here's a guy who knew all the media and so on. I start getting to know him and studying his stories, including those stories that become a Christmas story. the movie A Christmas Story, which is now arguably the most popular movie in America, seen by 40 to 50 million people annually just on the two Turner cable channels, TNT and TBS. Wow. And then all the DVD sales and people renting it and buying it and so forth. So it's phenomenally popular, not just the most popular Christmas movie. And I know people want to argue with me about this, but I've researched the data on it, and I think it is the most popular movie, and it's gaining in popularity every year. And so I started co-teaching with him. I have to explain that. Teaching for him was sitting on a desk in the front of a classroom and starting to tell stories. And if he was asked a question, he would tell a story which would answer that question. And then I learned from him that he learned his approach to storytelling from another northern Indiana guy. Shepard grew up in the Hammond area, who had an incredibly popular newspaper column, a guy by the name of George Ade, A-D-E, who told what he called fables. He wrote fables in a Chicago newspaper, and this became the most popular thing in the newspaper. I mean, super popular. You can't imagine anybody having a newspaper column today that would be that popular. When I was growing up in Chicago, you would think of maybe Mike Royko or somebody like that was popular. But this guy was so popular, and then he got syndicated, and then he started writing Broadway plays, and they became super hits on Broadway for months and months. And so George Ade, and Ade's whole approach to storytelling became Gene Shepard's. And what Ade did in these fables was to tell parables. That is to say, a story that works on two levels. So there's the entertainment level, the superficial level. That's kind of negative to say superficial, but the immediate entertainment, where it is fun. It's a gas, man. You are glad to be watching, let's say, that movie, and is holding your attention, and you're laughing, and maybe there are a few parts that are a little bit sad, little more pathos here or there, but then you start to think, wow, this is in the case of A Christmas Story, boy, it's set in 1940 approximately, and yet it's relevant for today, and nobody's living exactly the way they are then. What is going on here? And you begin to realize that there are some universal, what I call, this is not Gene's term, but this is what I used in trying to write the book, the life lessons. Okay, the life lessons. He would say the themes or the messages. And in fact, he has Ralphie in the movie writing a theme. What I want for Christmas, a Red Ryder 200-shot range model, rifle with a compass and this thing in the stock that tells time. So at any rate, I realized that what Gene was a philosopher of life. He was like a theologian or philosopher who was telling tales in order to get at important, what he deemed to be truths about human beings and the human condition. That's what he was doing. And he did not want to tell people that that's what he was doing, because he felt if he did, it would be like John Updike or whatever, sitting down and explaining a novel. You don't do that because that kind of demystifies it. Mm-hmm. You let the people in the college classes who are studying literature try to figure out what did this symbolize and what did that symbolize and all. Are you with me on this, Scott?
Yeah, I remember going to a AFI seminar in LA once, and the people were trying to decipher something that this director did, and the director just laughed and said, "No, I used that license plate because it was my license plate, and we didn't have time to run whatever." But this person was kind of taking that academic approach of this is what this letter means, and he's like, "No, you're way off base." And I know a lot of writers just say, "I write more organically." I could argue that it's just seeped into their system, and one of the techniques that I watched A Christmas Story over the weekend, and it reeks of conflict. And so I remember going to a seminar with a playwright, Eugene Urey, who wrote Driving Miss Daisy. And he said, I don't know why I was asked to come here. It was a kind of a one-day master class. He goes, I don't know why I was asked to come here, because I don't really believe that writing can be taught. And I raised my hand and I said, well, he basically said it can't be taught and there's no rules. You've heard that a lot of times. So I raised my hand. I said, what about conflict? He goes, conflict, you need conflict. And then he went on to tell stories like Gene would, but he didn't have kind of this, it seems like there's two different models out there. One that's very structured, and I almost think the two intersect at some point. And maybe it's the director, Sidney Lumet, used to say, I need to find I think he used the word armature. He needs to find a spine to the story. Now, the writer may not have had that spine, but the director is saying, I'm going to do this. Or maybe it's the actor, Paul Newman, bringing it to, there's things in the verdict that I think maybe weren't in the script, but in the way that Paul Newman acted it. So it's when it all comes together, and I think it does with A Christmas Story, I think that's what's exciting. So it's interesting to have you, the academic, with Gene, the organic, and that crossing. And the students had to just be thrilled, or maybe they didn't know what was happening, but that's kind of rare to have.
So Gene Shepard, as the writer, never had super notoriety. He has a huge following. There are Facebook sites dedicated to him and so forth, many, many things, articles written about him, interviews. He was most known for his radio show on WOR in New York, which was clear channel broadcast throughout the eastern seaboard and even into Chicago. I could pick it up as a kid in the 60s at night, and he was known for his storytelling there. So now, you could talk about if there's a star like Darren McGavin or Melinda Dillon in A Christmas Story, and they're well known. So Gene was not as well known, but he had a very solid approach to storytelling. As you said earlier, Jerry Seinfeld says he learned his entire comedic sensibility from Gene Shepard. And he learned it beginning with Gene Shepard writing a column in Car and Driver magazine, which was not just about cars, but about car culture and car people and love affairs with cars, especially male connections with cars. And Gene Shepard had that as well. And I did talk to Jerry about this in Malibu, because Gene differentiated between comedy and humor. Comedy is kind of one-line stuff like you would get on a sitcom. So the overall story is not as important as the one-liners along the way. Or the reaction shots, right? So much sitcom is based on the facial reaction shot. So when someone says something, you see somebody else responding in some way. And that's really critical because that comments upon how you're supposed to, in the audience, respond to it. But for Gene Shepard, it was all in the story. All in the story. And if you listen to or watch the movies, including Jerry Seinfeld's more recent movie, or you go back to Seinfeld, the TV show, it's all about the predicament. It's all about the story. People used to say Seinfeld was a TV show about nothing. And I asked Jerry about that too. I said, hey, if that's about nothing, then Gene Shepard and A Christmas Story is about nothing, which is another way of saying it's about everyday life. It's not about exaggeration, but it's about more or less a kind of verisimilitude, which says this is sort of the way life is, everyday life. And then, almost like a soap opera on steroids, to bring out everyday life. And that's what A Christmas Story does. But Gene always wanted it to be, and Bob Clark too, to be universal. So people would not say, well, that's the way it was in 1940. But that's the way it always is for all of us. Mom and Dad always feud over stuff. Kids get lost in what Gene used to call the maze of life, and so on. There will always be bullies. I mean, what I did with my book, Scott, was to take 20 of the 24 life lessons or themes about life that Gene believed, like a worldview, and to show how those are communicated intentionally in the movie. And I was doing an interview, a podcast with somebody recently. I can't even remember who it was now. But they said to me, so you're saying that in your book, these 20 life lessons were intended to be communicated. You're not just pulling them out. I said, right, because this was the discussion that I had with the screenwriter as to what he was trying to do. Now, in a few cases, the director, Bob Clark, significantly changed the script. And I have the original script, the shooting script, and then the final script as it was. And so I can look at some of those differences, but most of the differences had to do with cutting it back from something that would have been 2.5 hours to 90 minutes because the studio said you can't go more than 90 minutes. So I've gone on too long about this, but the point is there are life lessons.
Yeah.
And when you realize what these life lessons are from my book, and then you rewatch the movie, holy smokes, it's a whole different experience because it's like suddenly reading the novel after having talked to the writer of it who really opened up to you.
Yeah, well, that's perfect. I did exactly that. I did the audio. I listened to your audiobook, and I love your voice and the way it plays out on that. And then I watched the movie, and it did hit me a different way because I haven't seen it in maybe 10 years, and I haven't seen it since my mother and father have passed. So it hits you at different levels because of that. But going back to what you said about Jerry Seinfeld, I even see the sensibilities now in A Christmas Story. And what I would say is that Jerry Seinfeld's got this one bit where he's in a shower and he sees a pubic hair at eye level, and he's like, how did that get there? So that becomes a bit. The Pop-Tart thing becomes a bit. The puffy shirt in Seinfeld, the wallet that's too big. I mean, it just goes on and on. I think in my book, Screenwriting with Brass Knuckles, I talk about that Seinfeld isn't a show about nothing. It's about 1,000 tiny conflicts. And when I was watching A Christmas Story, I thought, this is really a movie about at least dozens, maybe hundreds of tiny conflicts. And the one that you point out in the book, the one that resonated the most with me that you wrote about, that you amplified, that apparently Gene wanted to hit, is the part of the movie that hits me the hardest. It's when he gets the decoder ring, and he's all excited about, okay, I've finally got this decoder ring, and it says, is it drink more Ovaltine? Is that what the decoder ring ends up?
Drink your Ovaltine.
Drink your Ovaltine. And I remember as a kid it was either Gatorade or 7-Up, and you pulled these little caps out of the bottle cap, and you sent in 500 of those. So you had to drink a lot, which actually had the opposite effect of what it wanted, because I don't want to drink Limeade, Gatorade, or 7-Up anymore because I drank so much. But they both had different contests, and I remember getting a race car that had a real engine. So as you're a little kid, you're thinking, oh man, I'm going to be able to drive this thing around. Well, it wasn't remote control. It somehow had a motor, and I hooked it all up. I started it, and it took off and then exploded. And then I'm Ralphie. I'm Ralphie at that moment. It's like and what does Ralphie say when he realizes he's been duped?
Yeah. He goes into the bathroom because that's the only place that he could get full privacy in the house to get that decoder ring going. You know, be sure to drink your Ovaltine. And then he as the kid, about 9 years old, he lets out that SOB term. Oh, and that is fantastic. PG rated. There was no PG-13 then. It had to be PG or R. So, but what then happens is he is so disillusioned, and he just walks out. And the older Ralphie, who is the voice of Gene Shepard,
right?
Okay, he basically says that Ralphie never trusted the media again. He doesn't use exactly those terms, but I'm using that term because one of the 20 life lessons that I learned from Gene that's in that movie in a couple of different ways that Gene himself believed deeply is don't trust the media. Don't trust the media. And he was in the media, and he didn't trust them. And in fact, he told me one day about he was in one of the guilds in Hollywood. It must have been the Writers Guild or something. I don't know which of the guilds he was in. He could have been in a couple of different ones. But there was an HR, human resource meeting, the Committee for Human Resources. And there are these well-known people on this committee with him. And he says to me, Quinn, he said, I'm telling you, those people are morons. He said, these are some of the stupidest people I've ever met in my life. He said, I wouldn't trust them with anything. He said, then he said this to me, Scott. He said, I bet those people don't even watch their own productions because they know their productions are so crummy. They're doing it just for the money, Quinn. He says they're doing it just for the money. He said that left coast Hollywood, they're a bunch of bozos, and he was so critical of them. Now, he was critical of the East Coast media for different reasons, seeing them primarily as elitist. So he was an anti-media guy who made his life in the media, but then he wanted to get through this anti-media view. Another part of that in the movie A Christmas Story is that the old man forever wants to win one of these newspaper contests. So every night he's there with the evening paper, the working class paper that would come out in the evening, and his sharpened number 2 pencil, and he's trying to get this contest finished off, so he can send it in and win a major award. and so he's working on it, and he can't get this really important question about the great figures in a history of American literature. What's the name of the Lone Ranger's nephew's horse? He can't get that one, and Mom says, Victor. He says, Victor? Yeah, she says, Victor. He doesn't know that. He puts Victor in. Then he sends it in to the newspaper, and he wins an award. He gets a telegram. The Bumpus Hounds are chasing him. It's a telegram. That's a major award. He's so excited. Well, what he's being duped into here is a couple of things. One is, what is a major award, of course, but that's the obvious one that becomes the leg lamp. But the other thing is that he thinks that he's the only one that got that right, and that's why he's winning the award. He doesn't realize that there are probably 30,000 people in the Chicagoland area who got it right, and then they raffle picked one.
So and of course, he didn't even get it right. As you point out, he's not as smart as he thinks.
It's not even
the
him.
Mom.
Yeah. So Gene said to me he wants to make this clear in the movie that this guy is a moron that shouldn't have gotten that right anyway, because Mom got it. So when the crate arrives with the major award in it, on the side it says fragile, and what does the old man say? Fragile.
Italian.
Yeah,
it's Italian.
Yeah, must be Italian. And then his his wife, again says, honey, I think that's fragile. So it's again and again. The same thing with Santa Claus. He's a fraud too. And he's been drinking. His nose is all red. He's got a flask in his pocket. You don't see it, but he's a nasty guy. He doesn't want to be there past 9 p.m., doesn't want Higbee's to have him work any longer and all. The whole thing is a sham. In fact, in one of Gene Shepard's novels, it's great what called The Fistful of Fig Newtons. The whole thing, which is, again, a series of stories, begins with Shepard setting the scene using a key word for all of the stories in that novel, and that word is mendacity. Mendacity. And he believed that the media are not really people telling things as they see it for real, but they're all trying to put one over on an audience to make money on an audience. It's all mendacity. So this comes all together now, and you see how Gene Shepard was not just having fun and telling stories. Though he was telling stories and he was a great storyteller, he always had this theme, or what I call life lesson, behind the scenes.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are some writers that talk about, I don't write from theme. I don't think about it. I think Francis Ford Coppola says, I discover the theme when I'm watching the movie in the theater. But Rod Serling, who kind of crossed paths with Gene, because he was in Cincinnati at one time where Gene was there too. And Rod Serling in The Twilight Zone is one of those things that's just enduring. And he said he always started with theme. And this is one of the things I wanted to point out is that, Gene was in the military, as was Serling. And for those of you out there that think, I was in school when COVID happened, or I don't have money to do this and that, I think Gene's example of hardships in life, and you can kind of just give a quick overview of that, but the way I understand it is, his dad left when he was young. He's growing up in Hammond, Indiana, and during the Depression. So you're starting out with no dad in the Depression. I'm not sure how they're paying the bills. And then when the Depression's over, then the war starts. So now he joins the Army, and he's stateside, but he's not starting out, in a privileged part, right? I mean,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He would have roommates. He lived with Shel Silverstein for a while, And Shelley became a great influence on his writing and really got him connected with Playboy magazine, because Shelley was already doing some drawings for Playboy and some poetry and stuff. Let me step back 1 second, though, in terms of this theme idea. So very frequently, writers will say they don't start with theme. And we could say that Gene Shepard did not start with theme. He started with observations about life. Okay, I was on the Mike Rowe podcast recently, and I had to fly out to L.A. to record that. So I carry earplugs that I put in the while I'm flying, because of all the noise, or a kid behind you, whatever. I can't think. So I opened the earplug little container, and it said in there something about please do not misuse. And so they got me thinking right away. How do you misuse wax earplugs? Where do you put them? What do you do with them? Yeah, and these are not earphones to listen to. These are just earplugs. I'm thinking, holy smokes! I mean, am I going to eat them? What am I going to do? Put them up my nose? And so Gene would find something like that, and he would say, "Boy, that's crazy." And then he would tie it in with some other things. So in his life, his old man was kind of a womanizer. I'm saying old man because that's the term that Gene used for father. He didn't use father, didn't use dad, he used old man, the old man. And when I was growing up in Chicago too, we all called our fathers the old man, our old man. We didn't call them that to their face, but that's what we called them. And so at any rate, Gene grew up in a very difficult situation, psychologically, emotionally, as far as I could tell. He didn't want to talk too much about that, but his old man finally bailed, took off with a secretary, a young blonde secretary in a convertible, went to Florida. He never saw his father again, and I think that emotionally traumatized Gene in some ways. But what it did was to give Gene a sensitivity through that life experience of how it is that males get obsessed with women or substitutes for women. And a substitute could be, Gene believed, anything, but particularly things. So it could be a rifle. Ralphie gets obsessed with the rifle. It could be a leg lamp. The old man gets obsessed with the leg lamp. And as Gene told me, the leg lamp symbolizes a trophy wife. So when the old man opens up that crate and pulls that thing out, he's suddenly starting to fall in love. Oh, it's a leg lamp. It's a leg lamp. I mean, what would a working class guy like that, or newly working class, let's say, newly middle class, do with a leg lamp, or think about it? I mean, this is not a guy with a college education. He's not a guy that would run across over to Chicago to go to the Art Institute or something. And suddenly he's got this leg lamp, this tawdry, semi-erotic, ugly thing. It's like a bordello accessory. and so the old man is suddenly smitten by this thing. And Mom is watching this. Holy cow, she's thinking to herself, what is happening here? And so the old man says, I know just the place for it. And he runs over and he puts it in the front window. Now that's the end for Mom right there. Is he temporarily smitten, or is it going to be long term with this obsessiveness toward this thing, this leg lamp? And so it turns out that every time she wants to turn it off in the evening when they're going out, he wants it turned on. And it's clear to her that this is not a temporary thing. This is an affair that he has going on with that leg lamp because of this underlying belief that Gene had that men are obsessive toward women or substitutes for women that become affairs. And we all know guys that have gotten into a hobby of some kind or a technology of some kind, and it's out of control. They buy all this stuff, they do all this stuff, and so that was Gene's part of his worldview that he wanted to work in there. And so the leg lamp is funny, but it's also a sign of what he believed male human nature is like.
Yeah, when she goes, spoiler alert, when she goes to water the plants, and you know what's going to happen, you definitely see that little reaction, that little smirk. At least that's what I sensed. Like it was premeditated that what she's going to do, which is accidentally or purposefully, the lamp gets knocked over and broken. And it's amazing how he does weave the mother as hero, as you point out in your book, into that story. And it seems like, when you get to the end, I mean, it is not as dark. If you go back and watch, the dad's always grumbling and he's got the furnace problems and the car problems and this and that. But he doesn't really come across as a super mean dad. I mean, he's not beating his kids. I mean, I saw things from neighbor friends when I was growing up that were much darker than that. But if you go back and watch the other perennial Christmas favorite Christmas story, the It's a Wonderful Life, it's a dark movie. I mean, it's a really dark movie. I mean, it starts out with suicide and kind of goes downhill from there, but it lands on its feet. And I think that's what's nice about a Christmas story that we can all identify with. We have all these conflicts. I love, the rifle scene we can talk about. We're kind of running out of time, but I love how the story ends, because we're back to the lamp area, right? We're back to the husband and wife, and there's a gentle moment there, and the snow's falling, and it's kind of, I once heard a sermon where the guy said, we are reminded daily that we live outside the garden. And it seems like movies are example after example of that, because
Yes.
movies are about conflict. And then how's it going to be resolved? Is it going to be resolved with this nihilistic view like the Joker does? Or is it somehow going to be Frank Darabont, who wrote Shawshank Redemption? He said, I believe that movies should have an uptick. Otherwise, what's the point? And I think both It's a Wonderful Life and A Christmas Story do have that uptick. It's not, life is perfect. Certainly in It's a Wonderful Life, there's much more exuberance and celebration there.
Yeah, we could say that it's about the ending in A Christmas Story is about reconciliation. It's not about a perfection that has set in. And the old man and mom along the way with their spats and everything else is about the everyday frustrations, the everyday conflicts, the everyday misunderstandings and all that stuff. And how towards the end there are the two critical scenes. The one, as you say, with mom and the old man back in the living room. Mom turns the light off and they get together on the sofa and they're touching in a loving way, and they have their wine glasses to touch, and they're looking out through the window where the leg lamp was. And now they're back together again. There will be other spats and there will be other obsessiveness on the part of the old man and the like. But that one is over for now. And Bob Clark really nailed that scene as a director. I think it's a spectacular scene. And the other one is where the old man of all people, the only adult in Ralphie's life that he doesn't ask to give him the rifle, is the one who, in a kind of moment of grace, presents the rifle behind the desk to Ralphie, and Ralphie goes over and unpackages it, and he starts to load it up, and the old man is there watching him do it, and you can tell the two of them, the father and son, are actually connecting, and you've wanted this kind of connection through the whole film. They haven't been at odds terribly, but they haven't been emotionally close. And Gene Shepard himself lacked that emotional closeness with his own father. And so they put that scene in there, and again, I think Bob Clark nailed it. And I can't remember the person who did the music in the movie, but boy, what he did in that scene was spectacular. And so, and then of course you have the two guys in the final scene, the two kids in their beds with the gifts that they really wanted, dreaming off into the night, and you get a sense that it's okay for another year. All of the world's problems have not been solved, but it is okay for another year in this thing we called life. And so I'll tell you, I love this book that I wrote. I mean, I've written a lot of books, you know that, Scott, and I never was going to write this one because I had all this information from Gene Shepard, the screenwriter, and my conversations and teaching with him, and I was just going to give it all to the Calvin Archives with other boxes of stuff. And the movie kept getting more and more popular, and I realized that every year that I would watch it, because of the background I had, the understanding of it, I enjoyed it more. And then when I would talk with friends about it, and tell them what's going on in the movie, they could not believe it. And then they would watch it again and they would say, I get it now. And they would enjoy it even more because of this parabolic level. And so finally my wife said to me last year, just stop talking about it and write it up.
Well, good for her. Good for her. Good for you for doing it. Because it's like we're 25 years past the death of Gene Shepard,
right.
And it seems to be growing in popularity. And I found a YouTube channel that has a lot of his talks on it. He's given the talk at Lenny Bruce's eulogy. I'm sure there's got to be a George Carlin connection. Just that social critique that he had was very stinging and softened it a little bit maybe for this story, or maybe Bob Clark softened it a little bit. But what do you think, because you point out that the movie was not a hit in 1983 when it came out. I could also point out that The Right Stuff, which I think is one of the best movies of the 80s, also did not do well. But why do you think that the movie didn't do well at the box office, but has had this incredible long life afterwards?
Yeah, a couple of things about that, Scott. One is that it was a low-budget film. They wanted to get Bob Clark to do a couple of other films. They wanted him to do a Porky's 2 and another horror flick. Okay, and so in a multi-film deal, they said, we'll give you a small amount of money to make this thing about this clown Gene Shepard, whoever he is, and that's on your own, but here's $3 million, go see what you can do with it. And so, and in fact, it wasn't enough, and Bob Clark had to put some of his own money in too to finish it off. So the studio didn't really get behind it in terms of promotion. So they did put it out there at Thanksgiving. Maybe it would catch on, they hoped. It didn't really catch on that much, and they pulled it from almost all the theaters by Christmas. But then the VCR came out. And when the VCR came out, that was it, because here you had a PG movie that was seasonal, and Christmas was the best rental season. You had all these mom-and-pop shops and the Blockbusters and all the rest were buying copies of this thing and putting it in there, and word of mouth took off. And then Turner, that owned MGM, decided since they had the Turner cable TV channels, they would start playing it. And between the VCR and playing it on those channels, it grew, and it's still growing in audience. Now, why? A couple of things about that. One is it's extremely well done. The integration of that script and the images and the editing and that voice over, it's not a narrator, but it's the voice of the older Ralphie offering the wisdom on his young life. And that voice is Gene Shepard's, who had a tremendous voice and an ability to add to it. All of that worked together. Now, there was a sequel that Gene did and Bob Clark did that is a disaster. I won't even give you the name of it because it was so badly done. And, in fact, in that one, Gene said to me one day, he said, Quinn, that film died on the casting table, or casting floor, I think he said. He said he didn't even want to take credit. He would like to pull his name off of it.
Because the other actors had aged out, right?
Yeah. I mean, now there's a more recent a sequel that has the kids that as adults and all, but that's a whole different kind of thing. So everything came together on that, but I believe that one key to it that is somewhat subconscious that has made it such a popular film ongoing is the fact that it gets at these universal themes. And you don't even quite recognize them when you're watching it. My book illuminates them, but they are there. And you get a sense that a real mom is a real hero, and she is going to protect her kids from something negative if the old man is going to maybe be too critical or too much punishment and all. That's a good mom. We get a sense of that. And Bumpus Hounds, the neighbors. Gene said to me one day, everybody fears having neighbors that they can't contend with. He said that is a universal thing. The fact that these neighbors had these bloodhounds that were all over the place. And interestingly enough, they loved the old man. The problem was not that the dogs hated the old man. They loved him. And the old man didn't know what to do with that.
They loved the old man. They loved turkey as well.
Yeah, they loved turkey as well. So it's got these universal dimensions that are built in that I think my book reveals. And then once you read my book and you see those things in it, you say, yeah, I had a sense of that before. Or the scene in the Chinese restaurant. Fa ra 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 ra. We've all had these cross-cultural things that are just kind of crazy at the time, and we don't understand one another. And Gene said to me that whole scene with the stealing of the turkey, and all, I may have mentioned this, is to be flexible. So there's a chapter in my book about being flexible, and Gene said to me one day, he said, in life you have to be flexible because it's not going to turn out the way you want. And in this case, the Bumpus dogs ripped off the turkey except for the wing. The old man looks at that wing, and you wonder, is he going to eat it or not? And then he just drops it, and he says, all right, everybody, go upstairs and get dressed. We are going out to eat. And they do go out to eat, and they have a great time. You see, the old man becomes flexible. It's not in his nature to be flexible. He's a control freak. But he becomes flexible, and we like that. And we've all had that. I tell a story in the book of what happened with me and my mother-in-law who came over when we had our first child, and I absolutely cooked some chicken to the point of it being all black and unedible. So I went out to Burger King and got Whoppers to celebrate with my mother-in-law with our first child. This is a great thing. So be flexible. Enjoy life. I could go on with the themes in my book, and each chapter is short. I use examples from my life, from the movie, and from Gene's life to put all of this together to show how that film works. I think it's a masterful film, and it's in the Academy's best films. I forget what they call that.
Isn't it the Library of Congress as well?
Yeah, the Library of Congress, right. And I think for good reason. It's a piece of Americana that's not just nostalgia, but it's taken a period of time and then it's developed these universal themes that we will continue to think about.
Yeah, I think as loose as a plot as it is of, early Ralphie wants the rifle, and he's told 3 times, you'll shoot your eye out, from his mother, from the teacher, and from Santa, you'll shoot your eye out, kid, he adds to that. And we kind of know, I don't know if I was seeing it for the first time, if I would know what's going to happen, but I think of things that I wanted. I think I can articulate it more as an adult. There's a neuroscientist out of Stanford named Andrew Huberman who talks about the dopamine. Our dopamine is at its highest right before we get the thing we want. And when I was watching that scene, I was like, for me, it could be a new camera, a new light, or a new whatever. I mean, a new car. And I remember hearing a guy talking about, he wanted this certain car, and as soon as he bought it, he was driving away feeling good. And then he saw the same car in a different color, and he goes, maybe I should have got that color. And so I think that's, one of those things, again, of how we realize how fickle we are and how we save up, or we want something. And the older I get, the more I realize if I want it long enough, maybe I'll get it. But even if I get it, I know that it's almost the anticipation that is the thing that's going to be the best. And Ralphie, of course, doesn't shoot his eye out, but there's some consequences to the gun, and that ends up being another scene where the mother can be the hero. I don't know if just to turn the corner towards the end, I don't know if this is in the book. It's in the audio book, so you tell me, because I think this would be really helpful to people, since this is a channel about screenwriting and filmmaking. Is you talk about the 7 steps based on Gene's writings. And again, Gene didn't have this. He didn't have a Sid Field, this is what happens here. But can you go over some of those 7 things? I mean, I would encourage people to get the book, get the audio tape. The audio book, I think, is great.
Yeah, I added material to the audio book, which was one of the. And by the way, I tried to narrate that audio book using my voice in a way that would be similar to the way Gene Shepard would do it. Okay, very hard to do that because he was so good with his voice, but I
enjoyed it. Yeah,
good. I had some other people that wanted to do it, some professionals and all. I said, no, I knew Gene, and I just want to try to do it the way he would have done it. So.
As a matter of fact, your book on public speaking is done by someone else, and I was like, oh, it's too bad he didn't do that.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's another whole story. Yeah, you write books, and what do you do with them? And on this one, by the way, I added extra material to the audio book that is not in the print version. Well, that was a circus because ACX, that controls the audiobooks on Amazon, does not want you to change any material. And they compare it word for word the print version and the audio. And if it's different, they won't allow you to use the same endorsements and images and everything else on the website for the audio one. And they gave me all kinds of grief on this. So I said, well, the heck with it anyway, because I want the audiobook to have some extra material that I added there. But I do cover the 7 steps as an appendix in the back of the book. And this was a problem because when I first wrote it out, it was about 16 pages. And then the editor said to me, hey, are you writing another academic book for those clowns in the academy, you know, those professors? You can't do that in the back of this book. People are going to look at it in the bookstore and say, I don't want that junk. And so it's not going to work. They said, you got to do that. You got to do that separately.
Oh, that's the meat. That's the meat for those of us that are always looking for, you know, a little keys to.
So I did it in a shorter appendix. Okay, so I kept it shorter. I just cut it back. It's the same steps. Now this is me interpreting Gene, talking to Gene. Gene, how did you do this? Before you did a radio show, before you did an audio recording, before you wrote a screenplay, before you did a stage presentation. He worked in all of these media. How did you do it? And so these are his steps. Identify something interesting that happened in your life. And so he made notes all the time. Something interesting would happen, like I mentioned with the earplugs on, and it says, do not misuse. And so you think of things, do not misuse earplugs, you know. So something interesting. Every week, almost every day, something interesting happens in the world around us. The problem is, for us, we don't make notes on it. We don't keep any kind of notes, so we don't have it. I keep all kinds of books of notes of interesting stories, examples, illustrations. So when I go into the classroom to teach about communication, I've got a story that's going to knock their socks off right at the beginning. And I can say, well, why did that happen this way? Or how would you have responded in that way, and the like.
Yeah, let me interject that Gary Kroger, who was part of the Saturday Night Live cast in the early '80s, he said that he was asking Rodney Dangerfield about comedy and how he came up with his ideas, and Rodney Dangerfield said 3 funny things happen to everybody every day. I just write them down. Yeah. And so and
Exactly.
and Jerry Seinfeld's very clear, when he was starting out, that he realized this was a job and that he was going to spend 2 hours honing his bits, where everyone else was kind of going up on stage and working it, and that works for some people. But I think people sometimes think, comedy's easy, and obviously it's hard, or everyone would be doing it. But I love how Seinfeld can articulate it very well. And again, you have that Gene Shepard connection there of, like, you see something, it's odd, you write it down, and maybe it probably 1 out of 100 becomes something interesting. So identify something interesting.
Yeah, something interesting that's happening each day. 2, identify the parts of the story that involved drama and character. Drama and character. Now here's where we get interesting, because the character, which we could also call personality, might be a person, but it might be a thing.
A dog.
A dog. It doesn't have to be anything.
700 dogs.
700 dogs. It could be a leg lamp, something interesting. It could be a Red Ryder rifle. The drama has to do with the things around us in our life and the people and the connections between those two.
And the conflict
The conflict that happens invariably there. So in the original version that was too long that I couldn't include in here, I used one story from my life about getting frustrated with a toaster. So I like my toast done a particular way. My wife likes her toast done a different way. And neither of us would remember to reset the toaster. So you go in there and you make toast, and it pops up, and you come back in the room and it's not done right. It's done too much or not enough or whatever. And I said, shit, I want a toaster that would have multiple settings. Is there such a thing? So then I go on Amazon, and I'm looking around, and I find a toaster, but it has many settings, and it's a toaster that's used in small restaurants. And I say, well, it's more than I want. It's a little costly, but this is really good. And then I rationalize it. If we have family over, we could have 5 different settings, and everybody could have their toast done right. See, this is a male thing now. This is craziness. I'm getting obsessed with the toaster, and it's becoming a drama in my life, and I'm doing all of this research and research. I finally order this sucker, and it comes in, and boy, I'm on cloud 9. You know, that's the dopamine hit just before I open it up. And then I open it up, and I look at the thing, and I see, how do you operate this thing? Well, you have to use an app on a cell phone. So now I have to have a cell phone app to operate the toaster to get the toast right, and I cannot figure out how to operate the app. I can get it downloaded and all, but the app is a pain in the rear, and I know my wife is not going to want to run the app because she doesn't like the technology stuff the way I do. So now I got a huge problem, and I'm saying, what the heck am I going to do now? I paid all this money. I got this thing. I'm just going to return it. I love Amazon. You can return anything. So I go to the sheet that comes with it to print out the return, and it says, this item is not returnable. Okay, now the character of the toaster and the conflict and me and my wife and this whole thing is out of hand, and I am super PO'd. And it's thinking, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? And my wife is asking me what's happening with it. Do you have it working yet, dear? And finally I say, look, I'm going to have, we're just going to have to get rid of it. I'll go give it to the a store we have that supports schools. You bring stuff in there. It's a resale shop. I don't know what else to do with it. I'll bring it to the resale shop. Someone else can deal with it. Okay. So I go over there to the resale shop to return this thing, and what's there on the shelf but the toaster that we just owned. So I end up buying back the toaster. That's a very simple little toaster that had like $2.50 on it because it didn't look like it was in very good condition, and bring that back, and I've lost $325 that I paid for this other toaster. So it's identify the parts of the story that involve drama and character. Now here's step 3 for Shepard. Identify the compassionate humor in your unfolding tale. Gene believed that you never make fun of anything that you don't actually have compassion for. If you don't love something, don't make fun of it. And he hated comedy and humor where it was all designed to put people down. And when I talked to Seinfeld about this in Malibu, he said, yeah, he said, I don't like that kind of humor either. I want humor that when we see it, we're going to see ourselves in it. That's us. That's
yeah, one comedian said the laughter of recognition was what he was after.
That's it. Beautiful. 4, relate the humor to an emerging theme. So now the theme comes in. So what's the theme about me and the toaster story? Well, we have to look at it in terms of me being a control freak. That's part of it that I have to look at. It's also me being a guy that likes technology. And I have a chapter in my book on A Christmas Story that I call Tackle Your Technology. Because Gene believed that guys generally create technology and then it gets out of control. It breaks down. It doesn't work. The furnace in the movie, he's always trying to fix the furnace. He's always trying to fix his car that freezes up in the winter. He's always trying to plug stuff in and it explodes and so on. So technology is not perfect. And so we could go thematically in the technology direction or the obsessive direction or whatever.
What would Gene do? What would Gene do with the AI? Yeah.
Oh, I've thought about that. I've thought about it. In fact, I just did a video. It's posted on my ham radio channel. I have a ham radio YouTube channel called Ham Radio Perspectives. And I did a video about a week ago, which is about Gene Shepard and ham radio, because we were both hams, and I learned about his views of ham radio. And his view of the ultimate dystopia of ham radio is where there were no humans involved, and it was just one ham rig talking to another ham rig back and forth.
We're getting there.
We're getting there. And I thought to myself when I was doing that video, and I said it in the video, I mean, he had a notion of AI, happening. And then step 5, very important for him, identify the points of exaggeration, or he would say hyperbole. You always have to use hyperbole. So the Bumpus hounds that come over and steal the turkey, there are, 485 of them or something like that.
It's a lot, yes.
It's a lot.
The mother hasn't had a hot meal by herself in 15 years or something.
Yeah, right, exactly. So he said, you use it to help make the point. You don't use it in some outlandish way that people are going to say, well, this guy's crazy. You use it to say, yeah, that's how we get about it. So he used hyperbole all the time. And the right hyperbole at the right time for him was critical. 6, tell the story using only theme-relevant information. Well, that's where the hard, you could say, editor as a writer comes in, and the hard editing of a movie. Because for Gene, if he's got a theme here, it's the old man, let's say, battling technology. So everything that happens when he battles, he hears the clinkers, clink, 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 and he runs down the stairs. He puts his gloves on first. He runs down the stairs to battle that furnace. He said to me, Quinn, that guy is going down to the 7th level of Dante's Inferno to do battle with the demons, with the devil's demons face to face, and he's going to lose. So then all of the language that comes up that you hear, he's swearing up a storm, and then the hyperbole, that his swearing was an art form, and it is still sitting over Lake Michigan. Yes. And I can tell you right now, this is Shepard S. Scott, so I can tell you I'm from Chicago. I was just there the other day. I go down to Chicago. I love the Art Institute, but whenever I'm walking through the Art Institute and I look out over the lake, I can hear the old man's language coming in. It's still there. It's eternal. It's eternal. Step 7, pay special attention to how you begin and end. So you've got to begin in a way that grabs people, brings them in, and you've got to end in a way, here's the key for Shepard, that creates satisfaction that story is over, but the story of humankind is not. And that's what we talked about with the Christmas Story. You get a sense of conclusion with the particular stories. Mom and the old man, they're okay now, and Ralphie gets the rifle he wanted, and so forth. But you know that there are going to be more similar problems.
Yes, there are. I think it was Frank Darabont who said on the 20th anniversary of the Shawshank Redemption that he originally had this European ending where Morgan Freeman rides off on the bus, and it fades out. And the producer's like, you can't take it all this way without, the audience wants them to get together in paradise. And Darabont said, well, I'll shoot it, but you have to give me the director's approval to use it or not. And he said, if I hadn't used that ending, we wouldn't be having a 20th anniversary commentary on the Shawshank Redemption. So I think there is a yearning that people want this conclusion. I think you talk about in your book that it's not only the conflict, it's the resolving of the conflict that is satisfying to the audience as a storyteller.
Yes. Now, Gene felt that Bob Clark did too good a job on the scene where Mom and the old man reconcile on the sofa looking out the window, because he said that it gave too much of a sense that that the next day or the next week the old man wouldn't have some other trophy wife. It was too much of a happy ending. So he did not like that one scene in the movie. He loved the movie, but he thought there should be a way of doing that where there's an inkling that there's some other problem. Like, let's say she comes down the stairs, turns off the light, turns the music up, and it's a silent night. And then she goes over to sit on the sofa, and the old man goes over and turns the music down just a little bit, and then comes over and sits down. You see, that would give a sense that not all is peace.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it worked the way it was, and obviously a lot of people do. Well, to end this, how can people find you? What are you doing now in your kind of post-teaching way? How can you got some YouTube stuff going on? You're doing some speaking.
Yeah, I'm still doing some teaching here and there in different schools, some undergrad, some grad, all the way up to PhD courses. Some of it's online, some of it's in person. So I'm freewheeling, man. I love it. I took early retirement to be able to do things that I felt called to do. One of them was writing. So I've got 3 books out in the last 3 years, and this one that we're talking about, you'll shoot your eye out. Life Lessons from the Movie A Christmas Story is just the latest one, and I'm been in this publicity tour, which has just exhausted me. There's so much interest in the movie and the book, but I'm doing a lot of writing, so that's fun. I'm also doing a lot of quote-unquote lectures where I go around to different schools. In February, for instance, already booked at Vanderbilt And I'm going to go in there for all of the film people, all the communication faculty, some from history and other disciplines, and I'm going to exegete the film from the standpoint of the writer and talk about how the film ends up having universal themes to it. And the title of my presentation at Vanderbilt, similar to what I'm doing at other places, is when, let's see, I got to get this right. When is a leg lamp a trophy wife? Which really sort of gets at the key thing in the use of symbols and storytelling and all. So I'm doing a lot of that. But to get in touch with me, go to my website. Here's the spelling of my name. You'll have it on your thing there anyway. It's Quentin Schultze. Schultze has an E on the end, even though I don't pronounce it. QuentinSchultze.com. And that'll lead you to my LinkedIn site and some of my YouTube. I have 3 or 4 different YouTube channels for different things, one of which is just on the movie. So I take a lot of the things from the movie. I'll use a film clip or a couple of stills, and I'll talk about them. And it's similar to what I do in the book, but it's what you can do differently in a visual medium like that. And I would love to get some invitations from people to go out to civic groups or big churches, have me come and speak. Interesting thing about churches on this, by the way, I found this season, is that many churches are loaded with people who love this movie but have never had anybody come in any kind of class or public presentation talked about how it deals with Christmas. And so I get asked this question all the time by people. They will say, well, gee, I don't know if it's even a Christmas movie. Is it a Christmas movie? And can you talk about it? And so one of the interesting things is I'll talk about Gene Shepard, the writer, and his faith journey, which is kind of interesting. Grew up nominally Presbyterian, and he became the kind of agnostic, I'll call this, that's very popular today in the United States. Probably most people skeptical about God, but they believe that there is a God, but they don't know what box to put God in. They don't know what tradition to hook themselves with. Gene has a great scene in one of his early movies that he did with PBS, where it's a baseball field, it's a church league, and I believe it's the Baptists and the Methodists are playing, and the ump makes a call, and neither side likes it, and they start fighting. And the team, and Gene, the older Ralphie, makes the comment something along the lines that this is how church wars get started. So there's all this great stuff that really relates to faith and to theology and philosophy because of Gene Shepard's life. And he used to do every year a lecture at Princeton Seminary, in the seminary, and did some fascinating things there. So I'm looking forward to opportunities, invitations for people, and hope that we can keep it going. If you want to learn more about my writing about communication and about storytelling beyond this book, then through my website, QuentinSchultze.com, you'll find about other books, including my public speaking book, which is fairly new. It's in a second edition and is widely used at a lot of schools.
Yeah, since you brought up, doing some talks in churches on it, you'll get a kick out of this. Is I was a couple years out of film school when I read Brady's book. There's a book, I think it's called maybe Screenwriters on Screenwriting. I'm not sure. It's an older book, but it's in that book where he's interviewing Paul Schrader, and I had never heard of Reformed theology, and Calvin is rooted in Reformed theology. And Paul Schrader, this is my first introduction to any of this. Paul Schrader is talking about Taxi Driver, and he goes down the tulip, the total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement. Yeah. I mean, in a screenwriting book. And right. Do you have in closing, do you have a Paul Schrader story from?
Well, we'd have to do a different different video on that. I know Paul, and I've written some things about him, and we have him in town here occasionally. Paul Schrader is a fantastic screenwriter and a good director too. But all of, I hate to even say this without explaining it because people will not understand, but all of Paul's films, almost all of them, are stories of redemption that are anchored in a particular kind of Christian theology, Reformed theology, you called it, or we could call it Calvinist theology. And it comes out in different ways. The film that I think it's the closest to that kind of theology, that's most obvious, is his film, ironically titled American Gigolo,
Richard
with
Gere.
Richard Gere. And this is a guy, a self-made gigolo, who is in the business of satisfying older women, let's say, and high-end, moneyed, and he gets into trouble for a crime that he didn't commit. Now, according to Calvinist theology, we're all guilty by virtue of our being human beings. Nobody's perfect. We all sin, so to speak. And so this guy's got sin in his life, and he's got you could say the big sin having to do with him being a gigolo and all. But at any rate, and I don't want to give this away in case people haven't seen the movie, but he gets into trouble, and he needs to be saved. And he tries to save himself, but he realizes he can't save himself. And there's a final scene where he thinks he saved himself, and it's on a balcony, and he's holding somebody over that is truly guilty instead of him being guilty over, and you have to look at the image and what that is, and the cross that's there and all with this guy, and he finally can't, I don't want to give it away, but so that's Paul Schrader and his storytelling. And he admits that openly. He says if he hadn't gone to Calvin, where I taught for 33 years, and gotten a sense of the importance of worldview and philosophy in human life, that our lives are governed more or less by ideas, some of which we don't even know, we're unconscious of. Or you could put it differently. This is Augustinian theology, which is also Calvinist theology, that we're driven by desire. And what makes human beings different from place to place and culture to culture is what hierarchy they have of desire. What's the highest desire, the lowest desire, and so on. And here I got interested in Gene Shepard, and I said, Gene, you're a Calvinist, and because this is what you believe, and you believe that nobody's perfect, and these things are bound to happen, but you believe that grace, good things happen in the end in spite of human beings. And he agreed with that. But he said, don't call me a Calvinist. I said, I agree with that, but don't call me a Calvinist. And I said, okay, I won't call you a Calvinist, but that's the kind of worldview that you're coming from. It's so fun, I think, Scott, to look at film or other storytelling in terms of the underlying quote-unquote philosophy or theology. For me, it's made my life exciting and interesting.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you taking the time. What you just said there reminds me of a quote from Judd Apatow on his master class, where he said that he likes to end his movies with a grace note. And my wife is more musical than I am, and she said, well, a grace note is musical. And I said, well, grace has multiple meanings. And I'm thinking, that Judd Apatow is talking about this kind of the ending of a Christmas story as a grace note, I think, in a literal sense.
And Gene had a way of putting that. These are his words. He wanted everybody at the end of his story to get a sense that you too have lived and survived.
Yeah, that's a good place to end. Thank you for taking the time.
Thanks, Scott. My pleasure.